Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Claire Barton, and I will be your host. This webinar is brought to you by the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, the only global qualifying organization in Canada where you can become a chartered governance professional. For further information about our programs, memberships, and upcoming seminars, I invite you to visit our website at www.cgiofcanada.ca. Today's webinar is entitled Disaster in the Boardroom, 6 Dysfunctions Everyone Should Understand. And our guest speaker is Dr. Randall Peterson. Dr. Randall Peterson is a professor of organizational behavior and academic director of the Leadership Institute and chair of the Ethics Committee at London Business School in London, England. Dr. Peterson's research and teachings has focused on board dynamics and conflict management. And he has also published a new book, Disaster in the Boardroom, 6 Dysfunctions Everyone Should Understand. This book is available on Amazon and Amazon.ca. We also have with us today Dr. William Holmes. Dr. Holmes is a member of the CGIC British Columbia branch, and he will say a few words before we begin the presentation. Before we begin, I would ask that you remain muted. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat line, and the questions will be answered at the end of the seminar. With that being said, I will turn things over to Dr. Holmes.
Thank you very much, Claire. As Claire said, my name is Bill Holmes, and I'm a professor in the School of Business at Royal Roads University here in Victoria, BC. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you this morning Dr. Randall Peterson, who is hailing to us from the UK right now in London. Dr. Peterson has published in more than 50 articles in top scientific journals, such as the Administrative Science Quarterly and the Journal of Applied Psychology. Randall's an outstanding mentor, having given the Academy of Management's Best Mentor Award teacher as winner of the London School's Excellence in Teaching Award. And Dr. Peterson has been invited to teach and consult across the world for companies such as ADNOC in the United Arab Emirates, Alcan, Arriva, and Barclays. Chevron, Texaco, Deutsche Bank, Emirates Bank, E.ON, GIB, IBM, Lufthansa, Nestle, Price Waterhouse Coopers, and Roche. Dr. Peterson holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of California, Berkeley. And prior to joining London Business School, he was on the faculty of Northwestern University and Cornell's University's S.C. Johnson Graduate School of Management. He is a former deputy dean of faculty, subject area chair of organizational behavior, chair of the PhD program, and vice president of the campaign committee of London Business School. I could probably go on, but in the interest of actually getting to the meat of this webinar, I'd like to welcome Dr. Peterson and invite you to take it away.
All right, thank you, William. Thank you, Claire, for those lovely introductions. I will try to live up to that. And thank you for everybody who's joining us today. And it's also nice to see a few familiar faces in the crowd. So I'm going to talk about my book. I'll tell you a little bit about how the book became, and kind of where we got to here. Let me, I think that's the right one. Well, here we are. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see that.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So I was telling both Claire and William before you all joined that this book got a really odd start in the sense that I was working with my co-author, Gerry Brown, who's a background in private equity, and he's got a lot of interest in governance. And he came to me one day. We're talking about something else. He just said, "I have this huge trunk, full of newspaper articles and clippings about boardroom disasters all over the world. We need to do something about it. In fact, Randall, you need to do something about it." And I was like, wow, okay. Well, roll on 2 years later, and the book showed up. So this is what we did with it. And I hope you find it interesting. And I want to be clear what I'm talking about, what I'm not talking about, and then I'll get into some of the specifics here. So first, I'm talking about the main board of directors, the people who make the big decisions. They can't defer anything else. And there's a lot of similarities, whether it's big company, big charity, big university, right? They all have this kind of public responsibility and ultimate decision-making power. I'm not talking about the top management team. I love talking about top management teams, but they are very different. And one of the big surprises to people from outside is just how big the step change is from management board, right, onto the supervisory board or the big board. And it's not the same, obviously, as having a family business or private equity, where you don't have that kind of public responsibility. So we don't talk about those. I talk about those kind of separately. And here is the very first review posted just a couple days after the book was released. And it pretty much says exactly what we were hoping to say. Most people think of corporate governance as dry and boring and stuff that happens out there that has little to do with me. But these big companies affect our daily life every day. And when something catastrophic happens, of course it affects us, if no other way, even in terms of those companies go bankrupt and taxes need to be raised, right? And so what this review just says is, you might think this is a dry topic, but it's not. And I hope if you get the book, you'll see, certainly for me, it was like, just as I was reading these cases, it's like, wow, I cannot believe this happens, in these big boardrooms, and just one after the next. But here's the basics of it here. This goes back, we document over 300 years of boardroom disasters. And when we're talking about disasters, I'm not talking about the rise and fall of companies over time, the normal cycle that companies go through. What I'm talking about is a company that makes a catastrophic decision, like is clearly bad, is clearly wrong, and they should have seen it coming. And that this is a history of over 300 years, and it's all over the world. So this isn't the problem of today, and isn't just a problem of a particular part of the world. This is a global problem. And the thing is, I think a lot of it has been gone under the radar. We've kind of normalized it as this, companies come and companies go. And yet, although they decline, the net of all this is the incredible wealth that most of us in the world now enjoy, certainly in my part of the world and your part of the world, for people on the call. So it's just normal that companies come and companies go. No, we're talking about the abnormal things that happen. The cost is massive. People die, environments get ruined, taxes get raised, right? That's just a small selection of the kind of things that we're talking about here. Now, here's, I think, the most shocking thing we found is that almost all the time, someone in the room knew exactly what was happening. And for some reason, either could not be heard or, chose not to speak. One of the basic truisms of boards is that truth alone never wins. You never change minds when it's just you. You simply have to have allies. So sometimes it was simply that. They just didn't do the work. But oftentimes, even if they did the work, it's like, I don't want to hear something, la, 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 not realizing there's a price to pay later. All of this is culture. And that's the other kind of big message here, The culture we create in our own boardrooms is the thing that really matters. There's a lot of rules, regulations, structures, etc., that most corporate governance books get into. And to be honest, most of the developed world has excellent corporate governance rules that need to be followed. There are good reasons for them. They are sufficient, they are necessary, but not sufficient for great boards and boardrooms and for avoiding these problems. So let's dive in. Sorry about this. It's a little bit small. What I did is I went to research and said, what are the explanations here for boardroom failures, and how does that match up to our case studies? So if I give you an example of that first one, I'll make it bigger here, the subordinated board, where the board is not truly independent of management. They don't stand aside and kind of really supervise. What's the core problem? The separation of ownership and management. And sometimes managers do what they want. So what is the origin of it? When the executive controls the board. What's the role of the board? To get the incentives for individuals to do the right thing for the business versus doing something that's self-interested. And then, what does an effective board look like? Okay. And then, and when they don't happen, right, then where's the hole? So let's give you one example, and I'll walk you through all 6 of the dysfunctions so you can see it. This is the classic one that every finance professor will talk about, agency theory, or principal agent problem. And again, it's important, but it's not the only problem out there with boards. That there are many others. So that really brings me to this kind of idea about, why do we have boards at all, right? In order to understand what an effective director looks like, in order to understand what mistakes get made. So agency theory, agency frame, there's something called resource dependence. So the organizations with more resources perform better, right? A good director shares the talent and the connections with the management. The world is complex and ever-changing, so a board helps the management understand what's going on, sense make what's happening. Back in the old days, it was all about more information is going to help you. These days, we are swimming in information, but what's the information to look at, right? How do I make sense of all this stuff coming at me? That's the problem. And a good board needs to be helping the executive to understand that. This small group of high status players control the firm, any firm with top team. How do you make sure that the right people are emerging into that top team? Do you have the right organizational culture and the right CEO? Right? Those are under your control as a board. So although you may not make the decisions directly, you make them indirectly by the way you set the culture and who you hire as CEO. And then as a group, we need to collaborate together as individuals, right? Work well together, examine problems rigorously and dispassionately. So we'll talk about group dynamics. We'll talk about groupthink. So 6 causes of board dysfunction that I hope you and everybody else, gets clear in their mind. I'm going to talk about each one, give you an example company, draw a few kind of final conclusions about maybe how we address all this. So first one, that subordinated board again, looking at that one here, it's now Meta, of course, but at the time, Facebook is our example here where, Mark Zuckerberg, again, got the company listed. Majority of shares are not owned by him, but the majority of voting shares are owned by him. So Mark Zuckerberg, although he has a board, can do whatever he wants, right? And that problem means then that this wider representation around the boardroom, the independent directors don't really have much in the way of influence. So what you get over time is people who are willing to be on the board because it's Facebook, but they're willing to be there without any impact, right? That doesn't end well, oftentimes, typically. The second one we looked at was what I call the distended board. That is where a particular culture has been really helpful in building a company up And then that goes kind of out of control. So things that were helpful in the past become more extreme, get distorted. So the example we have in the book is Uber. New technology, and you have to take on the organized cab companies in every city. Every city is different, has their own organization. And the way you get in there is by being, jump right in, be aggressive, right? And try to make sure you're actually, you're in there. And that they built a big organization that way, a successful one. And then once they were in, could show the advantage of it. The problem is that aggressiveness in the way they took on the cab lobby, right, which was required to take on the cab lobby, became the culture of the organization and how they treated each other, and created just this completely toxic environment where drivers are dispensable, where employees mostly are dispensable, right? And it was all about what you could bring today. All right, next one is conforming board or groupthink. This is where, and this is a classic one where we all want to agree so much that we don't think for ourselves, right? And it becomes, the focus on agreement becomes more important than the focus on, making the right decisions. And it's hard to stand up and be the only one, right? And in fact, you're unlikely to make any impact. So now I've got to find allies and stand up to the rest of the board. And if I don't want to do that, and nobody's willing, groupthink results. Now, our best example of this is RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland. RBS, and in particular, we're talking about the acquisition of ABN AMRO. That was, at a time, the largest acquisition of any financial services company in the history of the world. A massive acquisition. There was only about 10 minutes of board time with it. There was no real discussion. Right? Yeah, sure, there were side conversations and preparation that had happened before, but no real debate or discussion, right? Nobody, and it turns out, people said, oh, I had my questions about it or my doubts about it, but, you were working for Fred Goodwin, right? Fred the Shred. And, if you disagree with Fred and persist in that very long, you're not there for very long, right? And so people were kind of cowed by all that. And if you read the original groupthink, research, strong leader, lots of pressure, creates the perfect pressure cooker for groupthink. So it fits exactly in that kind of vein. Or a bystander board, where everybody looks the other way, hoping that somebody else's problem. And this one, our best example here is BP, and we're talking about the Deepwater Horizon scandal. If you'll remember that scandal, right, drilling into the Gulf of Mexico, deep underwater, obviously there was a problem, it broke, started leaking all over, and it was literally miles under the sea. For the first 7 days, BP didn't really do anything. Why? Because it was not their rig that was drilling that well. It was a subcontractor who was drilling that well. And the hope was that the world would blame the contractor, not them. But never mind, the BP name was on the side of the rig. Never mind that all the news was saying it was BP, right? The news didn't care about that distinction between the contractor and the ultimate person that owned that project. So after 7 days, they finally got into the middle of it. But for 7 days, while oil is leaking into the sea, right, and they're looking awful to the world, they didn't really do anything. Again, you read these things, you're like, really, how could that happen? I mean, to their credit, instead of going bankrupt, these people used that as an opportunity to make some serious changes in the board going forward. And things did get better, but for a whole week. Bureaucratic board, belief in rules. If the rules are there and you follow the rules, that is the necessary and sufficient condition for success. And I just told you that's not true, but some people still believe it's true, right? Follow all the rules is not enough. Well, there's a spirit of rules. You can never write the rules that, capture every possibility, right? So you have to have, the only way people follow rules is if they understand and believe in the spirit of the rules, right? This isn't really in the spirit, right? But if you create a culture which is like, there's the line right there, we could step over that line. So in this case, all the big accountancy firms have a string of problems in their history here, where they were always within the rules, always within the law, and yet scandal, right, over and over. So we think they're a good example of this. Next one is really about missing voices. So lack of diversity around in the room means certain voices aren't heard, and if those voices are relevant to what's going on, it's hard to make a good decision, especially in a crisis, because we don't like to go outside in a crisis. We look to ourselves within. In this case, we are talking about Google. Again, also changed its name for some of the same reasons that Facebook did, all the bad press. They'll say it's because they created other companies, but I think it's probably really Google. Do you remember the scandal where there was that paper published about why there are so few women in tech? Basically, because they weren't capable. That was the argument. And you think, how did that get anywhere in this firm, right? And be published in a way that is so obvious? Well, it turns out there were no women on the board. There weren't even women in the very senior management there at the time. I think maybe, I don't know for sure, because I mean we know a lot about what happened in there. We don't in most of these cases, we've actually are working from some informer within the board to get the rest of the detail. This is one where we haven't been able to get inside, but I would just wonder if it, it was the old boys club. It didn't sound so outrageous, and there was nobody there to say this is a really bad idea. This needs to stop. So those are the 6 dysfunctions that we've identified. Now, it's possible there are some of these examples where we might say, well, look, it's mostly, say, groupthink when it comes to RBS, but you could probably make a case to some degree for the subordinated board with RBS, because Fred Goodwin was so powerful, right? His threat to leave the organization struck fear into the hearts of everybody, on the board. They just didn't want to lose him. So yeah, that was another way of capturing the board. So it's possible you can have even more than one. We think the primary problem was a groupthink one, but there was a degree of, say, subordinated board going on as well. But these 6 seem to cover, most all of the examples here. So how do we solve this? Where do we go from here? Can we improve the quality of independent directors? There really is no official certification necessary. There's those available if you're trying to make an argument for why you should be taken seriously. But more importantly, most jurisdictions have no requirement for ongoing education. And even if you join with all the skills necessary, all of a sudden you're now talking about, ESG goals. So where's the ongoing education for that? And it would be, I think there's just not enough. Most professions require these things, and there's absolutely really very little to none of it in most jurisdictions. So we think there's a lot of things that could be done. Instead of new rules, let's talk about who's actually doing these things, and how we work with them. Can we improve the functioning of boards? So the regulator here in the UK, the FRC, has created rules about recommending every 3 years, for example, you have an outsider come in and assess the board. Most of the time it's tick box. Do you follow all the rules? When in fact, what they wanted and what they should be doing is, can you have a conversation about how we're working together? What is the culture of the board? Is everybody included in all the key conversations? And are we working as effectively together as a team as we can? That's what they should be about. Unfortunately, not as much as they should be. And a lot of jurisdictions don't even have the, even recommendation for any kind of outside evaluation of how the board is functioning. Seems like a missed opportunity. So building on that one, can we set some standards for what a good board evaluation should look like? You have to interview every member of the board. You want both individual and board level feedback for each of the directors. You want to focus on continuous improvement, not finding faults, but looking for opportunities to get better, right? Because otherwise it gets threatening. As soon as it's threatening, people withdraw and they don't learn. So it can even be focused on what improvements could be made. I hope regulators enforce existing rules a bit more seriously. They're not as serious, as I always say, the white collar guys don't go to jail. There's the rules are generally good, but probably could use with a bit more oomph in terms of how they're evaluated. And this last one, which we're really pleased is actually starting to change. That is, investors look at the finance, and they may even look at this, like the management team, but historically they've not really looked at governance. As far as we're concerned, governance of an organization is at least as important as who's running it, because they're the ones who guarantee the quality of who's running it. And so we're now starting to see investors take an interest in governance, which I think is a good thing. If you actually are a director, you may think, well, no, there's another set of eyes over us. But if you're doing a good job, this should be a good outcome. At least we think, hope and think it should be. And I hope we can kind of, in terms of the culture we want to create here, I always like this Bill Gates quote. Once you embrace unpleasant news, right, it's not as negative as evidence of a need for change. You aren't defeated by it. You're learning from it. Oops, sorry, I thought I had another one in there. So here in the, especially when it comes to board evaluations, but also culture more generally, we focus on, what you're learning from it. So lots of other things, if you're interested, that I've done on Boardroom in the last couple of years, from HBR on back channels in the boardroom to CGI was ISCSA here in the UK, to that report I told you about the FRC in the book. All of this is by way of trying to say, gee, it would be great if we could find a way to encourage boards to have clearer, more learning-oriented cultures, and we'd have less of these kind of boardroom disasters that we've been talking about. I've also got loads of stuff on my personal website. Feel free to go. Everything's free. Just go and take it. So most of that stuff is there for the free, if you don't have subscriptions to those places. I'm also on social media, and I tweet and post on LinkedIn in particular about corporate governance and what works, and not only what I'm doing, but what other people are doing kind of most days. So I encourage you to kind of join in that conversation, because I try to be a bit push the envelope from time to time, encourage people to really think hard about what good corporate governance actually looks like. All right. So with that, I think we were going to go to some questions now, right?
That is correct. I would like to invite anyone in the audience to add questions to the chat, and we will go through and select some. But I think I'll start off with a question for Dr. Peterson. Your book focuses on the dysfunctions of boards, but there's got to be examples out there of strong boards that have exhibited exemplary performance in times of crisis. Any come to mind?
Sure. I mean, there are loads of them out there that have done amazing things. We focused only on put it this way, most books on corporate governance focus on those. So we thought we really needed a lens on the other side. That's why we've done it that way. But sure, you could even go to BP board, 3, 4, 5 years after the Deepwater Horizon. If you'll remember, Deepwater Horizon was only the fourth of the giant scandals in a row, right? They finally woke up from their slumber and decided they needed to make some serious changes. So it's possible to go from boardroom disaster to good governance with a bit of work. And I think it's a great redemption story in an industry where it's hard, right, to be an exemplar of good governance, but I think they've done a pretty good job. So yeah, I think it is possible, and I do like that kind of notion that you can reform and get better, right? Otherwise, there's no hope for it.
Thank you. Internationally, we're seeing sort of a growing recognition of the importance of governance. And I know here in Canada, there are multiple organizations that are starting to offer training in corporate governance for aspiring directors or current directors. Do you think this is a good thing? And do you think that this increased recognition of the importance of board governance is actually having an effect on the quality of board governance internationally?
Those are two very different questions. Here's my take on it. I know that the UK obviously market much better, but I do. But what I've seen in the Canada situation is not very different, not that fundamentally different from here. But yes, I think it's a good thing there's more attention paid to, let's make sure all directors know what they're doing. We may make this assumption if you've been a CEO or CFO or whatever, that it's an obvious to go onto a board. And having interviewed lots and lots of directors, that's so not the truth. The truth is it's a completely different world. You have to influence through other people rather than making any decision yourself, right? That alone is a major transition. It's way more than that. You're also dealing with different stuff and having different audiences critiquing you than you did before. So I think it's a good thing. Certainly here, I think the vast majority of what people are doing is the stuff that's easy to teach. What are the rules? Let me give you a few examples of where it went bad and some very basic things about what not to do. What they don't do is talk about what I like to talk about in my classrooms. I collab we have it here as an executive fellow, Simon Osborne, who was the CEO of CGI here. He goes over all of that stuff with them. But I like to talk about when you come into the boardroom, what are the things you have, what are the things you don't know? So things like you're going to walk into a room and some of these people barely know each other. They meet 4 times a year, they've been pleasantries, etc., but they don't really know each other. But, what you don't know is those two over there go back for the last 40 years. And there's nothing you're going to say to one of them that's going to separate them from the other, right? Be very careful what you say if your observation is that so-and-so is a such and such, right? Because that could go down really bad. How do I know these things when I walk in the room? You've got to get that sense, start to build that sense of observe, watch, understand what's happening. And I always tell people, check out for just 5 minutes of a meeting and watch the nonverbals going on in a room, right? Because that's going to tell you a whole different range of stuff than what you're hearing through your ears. So that kind of the dynamics that happen in the boardroom, the culture of the boardroom, is the stuff that they're not really teaching yet, and is like so important for fixing the core problems that we're talking about. Culture is out. Sorry, go on. One last thing. Culture for me, right, is like a cloud. Clouds are important. They drop rain on us, right? They shield us from the sun at times, etc. And yet, if you try to grab a cloud You get nothing in your hands. And culture is the same way. And that is frustrating to a lot of directors. So I think not only do we need discussion about, about the dynamics in the room, we need a discussion about what is culture, how do you change culture, right? And what what do people think of our culture and maybe where it should go? Most importantly, how our culture should support the business, right? Because if it doesn't support the business, then culture will eat strategy for breakfast. It doesn't even get to lunch. So you do need to talk about culture and try to be active in shaping it.
Thank you. We actually had a culture question, which I think you at least partially answered, from Terrace. It says, how can you improve board culture through discussion? Like, what would be the process? And can you give an example of how this would be best handled?
Sure. What you need to do is to start with a good measure of culture. If you just start talking, everybody will talk. Even if they agree, they'll use different words, and it's hard to know what you really agree on or don't agree on. So there are lots of them out there. They're not hard to do. They can take 15 minutes of each person's time. And say, look, most of us think, most of us agree on this aspect of culture. Here's where there's some disagreement over here, right? And then start talking about how well that how well that works here in the room, how well that works to support the business and the things that we do. If you're Uber, right, being aggressive was very helpful up front in those early days and getting into the markets. But at some point it tipped over. If they were having an ongoing conversation or a periodic conversation about culture, they would have caught it before it became so toxic. Right? So it's those kind of things. I think absolutely a good conversation, ideally, I think if you've got somebody on your board who can do that, great. Otherwise, you may need somebody to facilitate that conversation, but that's not hard to find either.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Olufemi, and I'm going to paraphrase it a bit. Just thinking about your book and looking back on it. If you were to write a second edition, what would you add or change with respect to the content of your book?
Well, it's still pretty new. So far, not a lot. We had a big debate. There's a whole chapter on there on stakeholder, the stakeholder view of boards, which we debated in or out, because it has been kind of a sideshow in the corporate governance conversation, certainly pre-pandemic. By the time we get into the pandemic, it was like we sense it's actually becoming more central to the conversation, also with the ESG conversation. And we are so glad that we added it in, because it's very much become a big issue now. So we got that one right. So there wasn't anything immediate we need to change, but I think if we were to, see a big corporate scandal that really doesn't fit, I'd be happy to, to add to this. And yeah, I think that's probably the main thing I look at, is because we're still reading the papers, and like Silicon Valley Bank, like dying to know exactly what happened. Right, it will come out. We know some, but we need to know more. I would love to know more about that, because maybe there's something in there. Although it seems to be, well, I don't know. The accusation is something different than what we talked about, which is that they were so focused on diversifying the board, right, that they lost track of the other types of diversity that you need on the board. That we all had a conversation a little bit before about the difficulty of managing the cognitive diversity that you need, different experiences. You need a lawyer, right? You need you've got to have somebody, absolutely has to have somebody who understands the detail of the business. You've got to have, all these different things that you need. And then the debate with, with the things that we see, race, gender, etc. And how the main thing we told the FRC was, or one of the main things was, you're focused on demographic diversity, but this other type of diversity is really important. And if you get that wrong, it's likely to lead to to a different kind of disaster. We didn't have the right information in the room. Because so far, right, in this book, the right information is in the room. We just can't get it from the room to the level of the board. What if it's literally not in the room? Although to some extent that missing voices gets at that a little bit. But so anyway, I just think that maybe if something comes up we haven't really thought about, I'd love to add.
Thanks. There's been a lot of discussion and about the importance of risk management and the board's role in risk management. And what I've seen is boards have a role in identifying risks and sort of mentoring executive or C-suite people into also recognizing these risks and then addressing them. But what can boards do to help mitigate corporate risk and explore opportunities to increase positive impacts? This is a question from Chafika.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things I talked about in the talk about these different perspectives on the board. A board is not just looking over to make sure that they don't do something selfish. A great board, right, helps sense make the world with all the information flowing your way, and it also, which should reduce risk, right? You'll see the disruptive technology coming at you sooner. You're not going to stop it, but you'll see it and have more time to do something about it. This notion of that little group at the top running the organization. Do we have the right pipeline of talent coming through? The board needs to monitor that and really make sure that because one of the things I always like to say is the best investment advice I ever got was from a finance professor here at the school who said, look, if a company brings in an outside CEO, sell your stock. Because outside CEOs, right, they're coming in because something needs to be changed and there's nobody inside who can do it. I mean, so there's obviously been along the way some kind of screw up, right? That you haven't developed the talent that you need to run your business. That itself is not a good sign, but more importantly, people come in, they don't really understand the culture, and culture will eat strategy. Culture will eat a CEO overnight too, if they're not a good cultural fit. And really figuring out what that fit is with the CEO hire is really hard to do. So I think it's a great board is helping the executive all the time at reducing the risk of bad personnel decisions, the risk of not having right voices in the discussion, the risk of all these other risks. We usually think of financial risk, but like a risk register is a much broader risk than that. It should be much broader than that. And these are the kind of things that a great board really needs to take stock of and hopefully help to avoid.
All right, thank you. Bill is asking how often you've found a board that is truly independent and without self-interest in the organization's issues.
Well, you don't want them to be, that's what you mean by self-interest with what they're doing. Because you do want them to be invested in and helping. Now, we asked directors in our interviews, we had 100 and some odd interviews. Why are you a director? Like, well, why do you do this? And overwhelmingly, what they told us was, look, it wasn't about making money, even though I'm paid and paid reasonably well. I can make more money doing my own thing. I'm in this because I think the business is interesting for some reason. I think it's going to improve the world. I think it's going to be really revolutionary in some way. I think it's going to, whatever that thing actually is. So I want them to be interested in the business in that way. But if you mean interested in the business as in they have invested in the business, obviously that's a different topic. They can overlap sometimes too, of course, but that's less interesting for us, for me anyway. So how often do you find a truly independent board? Well, truly independent in terms of investments, like my financial future is in that board. You can find them, they're around. Not invested in terms of believing in what the company is doing. To me, I hope I never see that board that's not invested in that way. But I think you probably mean the other way, in which case I take, there's a reason why you're a bit cynical, and there's a reason for it. But that's why, again, in the UK and in many jurisdictions, it used to be very close, historically, up until the Cadbury report, very close 50-50 in terms of exact, non-exact. And they made very clear that it should be, clear majority non-exact, so that the one or two who are really kind of in the pocket of management don't tip it over into management control. And that makes sense to me.
Yeah, the next question is, I think, very much related from Lisa. She asks, most independent board members are appointed because of a personal, professional, or social relationship with the existing board members. It's hard to avoid groupthink, even sort of a development of an old boys network, et cetera. How do you break that cycle?
Well, how do you? How should you? You're absolutely right. Now, again, we asked directors recently about this, and asked about, did you know anyone before you joined this board? And it was about 50-50, yes and no, which I think is a big improvement compared to, 10, 20 years ago. So I think it's headed in the right direction, but it's very slow. And still not where it really should be. Are all these positions truly even fully merit-based? No. Right? Connection still matters. It matters substantially. This is where when they ask me how to do that, I always say, look, the best way to do this is, what skills do you need? Do your skills audit. What skills do you not have? And post not on like that you need certain experience, but that you have certain skills. Because you can see one pathway, through experience in executive to have developed certain skill sets. But if you let people define how they built those skills in a non-traditional way, or in a way not through that traditional pathway, you're going to get a much broader variety of applicants for these roles, and makes it much easier to appoint demographically diverse, also much easier to appoint without that kind of connection to Old Boys Network. So if you are determined to do it, that's the way to do it. Which is a bit counter, because some people like to have these appointments. You should have this experience and that experience and that experience. And those experiences are actually not necessarily what you need. What you need is the skills they represent. And separating these two helps, I think, to open up that conversation to a broader variety of people.
Great, thank you. Just before we started this session, we were talking about possible questions we can get, and you said, well, I always get a question. If I could answer that, I'd rule the world. Well, I'm going to ask you one of those questions.
Okay.
So, do we have it right from a system perspective? Are our systems of corporate governance sufficient for the rapidly changing economic, social, political, and natural environments? And are there alternatives that we should be looking at?
Well, there certainly are alternatives because, the big listed company is a phenomenon. That's a Western, not entirely, but I mean, it dominates Western business, but does not dominate at all, in much of the rest of the world. So are there alternatives? Yes. Do they have advantages? Yeah, in some situations, right? So if you're talking about either private equity or, say, a family business, their ability to act quickly and change is better than the big listed companies, even for similar size. On the other hand, in practice, they get bogged down in a lot of other stuff, especially family dynamics. And for family business, family business ties people closely through connections with family, allows you to move quickly, but also means when there are disputes and anger, etc., right, it's very easy to spin and spiral. Oh gosh. So, I still believe in boards as a way of ultimate authority in these big organizations, and in protecting the public interest. That's their role. Make it safe for people to invest in those businesses. The evidence is pretty strong that they have served us extremely well. And if we think about how boards used to operate 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, show up quarterly for lunch, and that's about the end of it, right? Have a drink or two along the way. Now, boards actually have to work now. I think it's a good outcome, and they have to work because the world is getting more and more challenging for corporates. I expect that trajectory will continue. Will it get to the point of breaking point at some point? It's possible. I don't think we're there yet. And I see so many great boards too. I mean, this book should suggest that there are lots and lots of great organizations too that are very well governed. So I remain optimistic about it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Peterson. I have thoroughly enjoyed this chat, and I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. And I have to say, I really enjoyed reading your book. And I can't recommend it enough for anyone who's interested in corporate governance, whether they be the layperson, the director, governance practitioners, or academics. I think it was a great read. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to do this. And if anybody wants to reach out and get in touch, I'm perfectly happy to do that for anybody.
Great. I'd like to turn the session back over to Claire.
I just wanted to thank you very much, Dr. Peterson, for that excellent presentation. It was wonderful. And I'd like to also thank you, Dr. Holmes, for joining us today on behalf of the BC branch. And I'd like to thank everyone here who has joined us. And I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you very much.